Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I will be discussing my ranking for Timothy Zahn's Star Wars novels. Now, before I begin, I should say that this is my personal ranking, and so I'm sure people will disagree with me on my placement of things. I know my number one is controversial, but let me know in the comments what you think. If you've read his books, which one's your favorites, what's your least favorites? If you could do a ranking, how could you? And I would also like to say that my ranking is not going to be as exact as some people might think. So, Timothy Zahn has written 16 Star Wars novels, which is quite a lot, and he has the record for the most adult novels written for Star Wars, and as a result, it would be really difficult to rank all of them. However, some of these books I have grouped up together. For instance, the original Thrawn Trilogy is so cohesive that I grouped it into one. The Hand of Thrawn duology I grouped into one, and the most recent Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy I grouped into just one story. Now, the new Thrawn trilogy, the books are so separated that I kept them separate as individual novels instead of a traditional trilogy and lumping them together like I did with the others. So my number is going to be 11 total for books and series by Timothy Zahn for Star Wars ranked. So without much further ado, let us begin. My number 11 is Survivor's Quest. My number 11 and my number 10 go back and forth in my mind between which one I think is the weakest. Timothy Zahn is probably the strongest Star Wars author. He's not necessarily my favorite, but he's definitely the strongest, but this is definitely the weakest of his work. The biggest problem I have with Survivor's Quest is that it is the first story you see of Luke and Mara Jade as a married couple, and it just doesn't, they don't feel connected. They don't feel like that new, freshly in love couple. They don't give off those vibes in this story. They still feel very much as they did in the previous stories. That, I think, is a major issue. Secondly, what I think with this book is that Outbound Flight covers quite a lot of ground, and I think that Survivor's Quest is largely unnecessary because of that. I mean, there are some cool revelations, but as a whole, this story, it feels like it was unnecessary, even though this was written first before Outbound Flight. I just think Outbound Flight is a much better book, and so that's why this is my number 11. The number 10 on my list is probably not a surprise to most people, especially those who have listened to my podcast that I've done, and that is Thrawn Alliances. I apologize that this one has some sticky stuff on it. I wasn't able to get it off when I bought it. I hate those stickers that they put on at Barnes & Noble and other stores where they just stick on a big sticker, exclusive edition. Anyway, this is the second book in the new canon Thrawn trilogy, and this is the one with Vader and the one with Galaxy's Edge. And this was just such a disappointing book. It had such promise. You get Vader and Thrawn in a room. Like, literally, the pitch of this book is Vader and Thrawn walk into a bar. That is the literal pitch. It lacks a certain energy because Vader is so monotone, and because Thrawn is also so monotone, the story itself just drags. It doesn't have the youthful, vibrant energy that it needs. And what this story needed was someone such as Eli Vanto, who was in the first Thrawn book, as in the third one, Treason, and he's not in this one. And so as a result, it just feels so lacking. It feels like he could have done better. Now, there are some great ties into the Clone Wars that I really liked, and some ties into the Ascendancy trilogy that comes in that I'll talk about later, but it just as a whole, it's disjointed. There are moments where you're just like, I don't care about this, I want to get to this part, or I don't care about this part, I want to get to this part, and it just doesn't keep the reader engaged. Likewise, I don't think the story was that important. The biggest thing is Zahn wanted to A, tell another story, write another book, and B, try to do something original of Vader and Thrawn. And while I give him props for taking a swing, it definitely is a miss. And so that's why this is my number 10 on my list. Those are the books that I thought were okay. The next ones I think are good, not amazing, but good. And so number 9 on my list is Choices of One. I think that Choices of One is a really interesting story. You have Mara Jade and her troops who have essentially abandoned the Empire, but they still are kind of loyal, and they're particularly loyal to her. And I thought that this story was fun. It was quick. You have some characters show up. Thrawn makes an appearance, and Zahn, I think, was trying to lay the groundwork for a big story that he could do in the future, and he just didn't have the time to do it. If the EU had continued, he might have written that story, but he just didn't have the time to do it in this book. And so, as a result, the villain kind of falls flat in this book. Likewise, Luke, Leia, and Han also make appearances. Particularly Luke makes a strong appearance in this book, and it doesn't have the magic that Timothy Zahn books have. What this book does have going for it is the main characters of Mara and the Stormtroopers. I'm blanking on their names right now, but you know who I'm talking about. These guys are they have really good chemistry together, and their interactions are just fun. And it was this kind of EU story of focusing on a small group, these stormtroopers who had defected from the Empire, and it was a good continuation of Allegiance. The next book on my list, number 8, is the book Scourges by Timothy Zahn. This is the working title for this book was Solo's 11, and that makes total sense because this is very much an Ocean's 11 story. And I think that this is definitely one of the more unique covers in Star Wars, but it really gets the tone of the book well. Timothy Zahn, this is by far his most whoa. That's an interesting decision to make there. And what he does in this book is he tells a heist story, but sets it and makes it feel like Star Wars. There are a lot of moments, particularly in this story, which reminded me of the old Han Solo trilogy and the Lando trilogy from the 80s and the 70s. You know, it really felt like old school Star Wars. And yet Zahn was able to incorporate all these characters who are throughout the expanded universe. And so it kind of blends that old school EU with the new EU, plus it is able to tell just that's not an expected story. Whenever a new story is able to have a truly unique element to it and doesn't just feel like a by-the-number story, really sticks out for people. And that's why I think this is a pretty good story. The next in my list, my number 8, I believe, is Allegiance. This is the book that when I read it, I was like, that is an interesting strategy. This is when you meet those stormtroopers who have defected the Empire, and really, I can't go into too much more because it's been a while since I read this book, but I do remember that of the later EU books that Zahn wrote, the stuff that he wrote right before the EU was scrapped, this is one of the best that he did in that time. Number 7 on my list. Now we're getting into the really, really good, almost, I would say, really great era of his storytelling. And the first one I'll talk about, which is my number 7 overall, is Thrawn Treason. This book, I know one friend who will be disappointed that I put it so low because it's his favorite of all the Star Wars books, but I really enjoyed this book. This was one of the first Star Wars books that I read in one day. I picked it up in the afternoon and I started reading it, and I figured I was going to read a lot of it that day. I did not expect to stay up till 2 a.m. reading this. It is such a quick story. It only takes place over the course of a couple days, whereas some of the other books take place over months or years. And what this book did was it gave Thrawn an effective foil, and it gave him a energetic character to play off of in Eli Vanto's return, something that Thrawn Alliances was sorely lacking. The plot in this book is not anything too masterful, but the way that he turns it into a mystery towards the end is what is masterful. And the bait and switch in this book is so good. It is so brilliant the way Timothy Zahn was able to pull this book off. And I really appreciate what he did. Now, the next book on my list is my first grouping that I've done, and it is a full trilogy, and it is going to be the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, including Chaos Rising, Greater Good, and Lesser Evil. This was a trilogy where Timothy Zahn knew from the start where he was going. He was able to write it really quickly, and it really feels cohesive. There are some trilogies like Aftermath in the canon, which kind of, each individual book I think is good, but as a trilogy, it kind of feels like they didn't know where they were going at the beginning, and it feels all over the place. This trilogy feels perfectly cohesive. The way that it expands, it tells a true sci-fi story in Star Wars. If you take out the Star Wars characters and terms and replaced it with generic sci-fi names, this would work really well as just a sci-fi novel. It really reminded me of Timothy Zahn's non-Star Wars books, which are substantially different in my opinion. And so I really enjoyed this, and the way that this trilogy had impact and character moments, and it took a risk, but without... Sometimes Star Wars stories will take a risk, and it will be bad because the risk doesn't feel like Star Wars. Or it will be safe, but it'll be too safe, and it'll feel too much like Star Wars, and it'll feel like a redo of Star Wars. And you probably know what stories I'm referring to there. So you have to get this kind of middle ground where you're taking a risk, but you're also kind of still following the tropes and the lanes of Star Wars, and this does that really well. My only issue is that sometimes he has too many characters, and they're also, their names are so similar, it is really hard to keep track of. And I think that on a reread, I'd even enjoy this trilogy even more. But on first read, I really enjoyed reading the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy. Now we're getting into my top few. These are the greatest of the greats. These are the, oh my goodness, these are amazing. So to start out that list, I have Outbound Flight. This is a book, and I'm just going to move this so that it's not in my camera's way. This is a book that really captures the reader's imagination. It feels like a Star Trek plot in a Star Wars world, but in all the best ways. You have this kind of first contact situation between these people who are fleeing, these smugglers who are fleeing, and the Chiss. And then on the opposite side, you have the Jedi, particularly Joruus C'baoth, who has decided to lead an expedition into the unknown regions to try to expand the culture and expand the knowledge of the Republic. And that's why you have the title Outbound Flight. And so it's this kind of not really Star Wars-y story, but with amazing action, with amazing twists and turns, and you get Obi-Wan and Anakin, and you get the Emperor, and it's hit one of his few prequel-era stories. And so this book really just hits all the right boxes. It's kind of self-contained. I mean, yes, it ties into Survivor's Quest, but you don't need to read Survivor's Quest. This book is a very self-contained book. And yeah, I reread this book a lot because it's just one of those standalone books that I'm like, yes, you did that really well. The next book on my list, and we're getting into my top, my top three. My next book is Thrawn. This is a good book. This was one of the first books that I bought on release day, and I was so pumped to read this book. This was around Celebration 2017 that this book was released, and the hype for Thrawn was real. I remember watching the live stream where they announced at Celebration 2016 that Thrawn was coming to Rebels and Thrawn was going to get his own book. And I had not known anything about Thrawn before that point, but I saw the old cover art of the original Thrawn trilogy and read them in preparation, and then I read this book, and I thought, oh my goodness, this book is brilliant. The Sherlock Holmes versus Moriarty storyline is great. The fish out of water where Thrawn doesn't understand politics, doesn't understand the nuances of the Empire is great. The way he rises through the ranks from literally nothing to being a Grand Admiral is great. The way you see someone like Arinda Price rise through the ranks, fall all the way back to the bottom, and rise through the ranks again is great. The way that everything just ties in together at the end for this epic ending just makes this his best standalone novel that he's written. And even though, yes, it's part of a trilogy, the trilogy doesn't feel like a trilogy at times, so this is a really good standalone novel that I recommend. And it's a good jumping in point for him. My next books that I'll talk about, we're getting in the top here, is going to be the original Thrawn Trilogy, which includes Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, and Last Command. And I have lost Heir to the Empire. Bear with me for just 1 second. Don't know why that one missing. Here it is. Oops. You have Heir to the Empire, the Dark Force Rising, and The Last Command. This is the OG Thrawn Trilogy. When you think Star Wars books, a lot of people think of this trilogy. This is what kicked off the expanded universe. This is what proved to Lucasfilm that they can make literature profitable. This is what meant Star Wars is on the New York Times bestseller list. This is the trilogy that really swung for the fences originally. I talk about that a lot. Timothy Zahn takes a lot of risks while still being the most successful Star Wars author. And maybe that says something to the others that they should also take a lot of risks. But he takes risks and it almost always works. And so this trilogy, you get Han, Luke, and Leia as the main characters. You get an epic villain in Thrawn in this trilogy. He's a true villain in this trilogy. You have great political work in this time, before the prequels even made politics big in Star Wars. Great political work, great strategic work. You really have to think about the plot in this one because it's all so convoluted, and yet it's just so much fun to read. It feels like 1977's 1980, 1983 classic Star Wars feeling. And it also shows that you can have an interconnected universe that's not just movies and TV shows. And so this trilogy is just almost flawless. But it's not my number one. You might think that's a bit controversial. My number one is the Hand of Thrawn duology, Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future. I do not know a single person who has put this as their number one, but I loved these books. So one thing these books did was they wrapped up the whole Empire versus Rebellion storyline once and for all, which I thought was great. Another thing that these books did is it finally put Luke and Mara Jade together, something I've always wanted. And it kind of told a story not too dissimilar from the story of Hosea in the Bible, which I really appreciated. I liked Luke going out, even though Mara has rejected him so often, he goes out to save her, even though she still might reject him again. He's going to save her because it's the right thing to do. It shows such good character on his part. Then you have Han and Leia constantly they just want a break and they can't get a break, and you have now Admiral Pelion doing some great stuff in this book series, and you have the best part of this trilogy, or this duology, I say. It feels like a trilogy because book 2 is basically 2 books in one. You have the triumvirate. You have the military mind, the political mind, and then you have the guy who looks like Thrawn, all serving as one Thrawn, and it shows how powerful Thrawn was. It reminds me of when Caesar died and you had a triumvirate try to take over in his stead. It's funny, it's witty, it's great. There's tons of... This is when the expanded universe was reaching its height of popularity, and so there's tons of expanded universe references and callbacks and stuff, but I highly recommend this. I would read his other books first, but this, oh my goodness, the way he did this was great. So those are my Timothy Zahn novels ranked. I think I got some of my numbers mixed up somewhere in there, but it was fine. It was all lots of fun. So let me know in the comments what your favorite Timothy Zahn books are, specifically for Star Wars, and if you've read his other books, what you think. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.